Gracious Father, we are privileged to gather here before you, Sabbath morning, Sabbath afternoon for some. We ask the blessing of your Holy Spirit in our midst. I'm reminded continually, Lord, that our life is your story, a scene of men. Pray, Lord, that you would give me the words to recount the events of my life and how you've led in it. I'm very grateful, Father, that you are there in my life. Bring hope, make joy out of misery. Be with us today, we pray. Well, as it says on the screen, I'm Verne Bedwell. I'm 61 years of age. I was born in Whitehorse City in Yukon, Canada. Also known to North Americans as Land of the Midnight Sun and the Great White North. And it's not always the Land of the Midnight Sun. The opposite of that is total darkness for many months of the year. Further north we go. For those of us that live in the North Country, we're used to the lands of extremes. Was born in 1960 to a Pentecostal pastor and his wife. As we go through this today, it wasn't always a enjoyable time being a pastor's son. We moved around in the province of British Columbia. We left the Yukon when I was 3. And we moved around in British Columbia for many years. In 17 years, we moved 17 times. And yet we managed to stay in one community for 5 years and another for 3. So it kind of tells you that we were very mobile the rest of the time, and that's not good for a young man. It certainly wasn't good for me. My father, though being a pastor, was what we would call today bipolar, and a man of many extremes. A man of great talents, a man of great passions, and yet seldom there for his family, busy pursuing ministerial things. Now, little context on it, he was a logger full-time. He was raised in the lumber industry. His father owned the Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan sawmills. And as such, he came into life with a great passion and pursuit for things, but a man that didn't find a lot of love and respect for his own position. He was constantly seeking the approval of others and suffering at that time what I say is now known as bipolar, was more known in my childhood as manic depressive. For those that know what manic depressives are, life is a cycle of highs and lows in the extreme. And so as a young man, I grew up walking on pins and needles. It was a matter of constantly being aware of your every word, your every action, unless you be confronted with the anger that comes with a manic state and the constant lows that come with depression. And I tell these things because I love my father dearly, although I've never had a relationship with him. And that makes it difficult for one to relate to a loving father in heaven. So today, as I go through the trails of my childhood and such, I go through them so that we can see each how we're formed by the environment around us. Because I tried very much to not put my children in a similar environment, and yet failed in many ways, because we are a product of our environment, and our character is formed by those experiences. As I said, we started in Whitehorse, Yukon in the Great White North, and we moved south slowly by stages into northern BC, and then the extremes started. Then we bounced from one end of the province to the other. Often we'd move in the spring and again in the fall, as the lumber industry experienced what we call breakup here in Canada, where the ground becomes too difficult to work on because of weather changes. And there's usually a month to 2 months where you can't work in the bush. And at that time, my father would decide it was time to go on and shepherd a flock in another community, and we would yank up stakes and move again. And so I grew as a child to lacking friendships. There was no time to develop them. And when you did, they were soon yanked away. And I just didn't make any effort to develop it. Now, again, in context, I was raised with two siblings. There was four of us, but one of us lost quite early in my life. That was the trauma that took me many years into my adulthood to get over. I had a younger brother well, I had two sisters, but I didn't get a younger brother till I was 5 years of age, and greatly welcomed him. But then I lost him before I was 7. Lost him in a creek outside of our home, a parsonage that had been given to us by the local native elders so that we would live in their village and share the love of Christ with them. And that event happened on a early spring morning. We lived right on the edge of the creek. There was a log fence around our home, and I had gone out the gate to go fishing. I very carefully closed the gate behind me, but unbeknownst to my mother, who let my younger brother out in the yard to play, he had managed to figure out how to go over the top of this little log fence, and he was just under 2 years of age. The long and the short of it, he fell in the creek, and we lost him that day. I was on the other side where I couldn't see him, but I did not realize at that time. It took well into my adult life for me to realize that I had blamed myself for that, and that, on top of all the other things that I learned to blame myself for over time, definitely had a mark on me for many years. It left me, I guess, before I found Christ, and even well into having found Christ, I was a deist at heart. I never did not believe that there was a creator. It was evident all around me in creation that there was a God there, but I didn't see him as a loving God. I saw him as one who made all that is and then was standing back watching to see what we would do, waiting for each opportunity to discipline us. Because this was the experience I had as a father. My father's observations were generally to make sure that I didn't embarrass myself or him. And that meant harsh disciplines when I did go astray, which I seldom did. But those events were sadly memorable. As time went on, we moved in all these various communities, met people of many different types, moving back and forth from the city to the country. We ended up in Calgary, Alberta, the only time I've lived out of the province and the only time I've been much out of the province. And while living there, finishing my high school, many events, but I became involved in a number of different businesses. And the one that was the most memorable for me, I became an industrial radiologist, and I traveled all over Canada inspecting pipeline work and learning to do non-destructive testing. I was doing this under the guidance of a gentleman that I had met while working on one of my hobbies, which was building working model aircraft that flew. I started with line control and then moved into the radio control, which was in its infancy at the time. And I met this gentleman doing that, and he became a father figure to me and became my employer. And while doing that, he sent me to work for somebody else he thought would be a good experience for me. And that took me into southern BC, where I met my wife. And so that's why I say that was one of the greatest events for me, because I had no intention of becoming married. I was career orientated, and I really didn't want to be involved in a marital relationship. I didn't see it as a positive thing. Many of my experiences as a child were the harshness of marriages that weren't working. And that was the case in my own home. My father and my mother's relationship, due to dad's nature, certainly not mother's, was a very difficult thing. And so I was not excited about relationship nor bringing children into what I saw to be a very chaotic world. But I met my beautiful wife, and didn't meet her under the best of circumstances. I met her in a cabaret dancing in an evening, looking for an out or events, because by the time I met my wife, I had become a drug addict and an alcoholic. And those, of course, as we know, aren't great ways to walk. And they certainly didn't lead me towards the Lord. And I'll mention a little bit about that, why this is, to me, the loving Father that we have in heaven is something that we know there is one who desires to hide from us. And he had certainly been effective in doing that in my life. My father hadn't learned to convey the love of a father, and although he was, I will say, most certainly a diligent man, a man who taught me how to work to be a good steward. He was one who labored to meet the needs of others continually. at the expense of his family, which was something that I've had to learn to try and find a balance in my own life because I carry that same nature. I love to work. I would say I'm an aholic, a workaholic these days. But under my father, I learned the harshness that comes with the lack of balance. And there was definitely a lack of balance with my dad. And so I saw him as a dad. I never thought of him in the context of what we understand as Christians to be a loving, kind father. And I don't fault him for it. I pray for him daily. He's still alive, albeit not sure if he'll know me when I visit next time because he's in his late 80s and he suffers with dementia. But when I met my wife, as I said, I wasn't looking for a companion. I was just out with the boys for an evening at the local cabaret trying to fill our time. And over the next few years, I actually met her on my birthday in 1979. And over the next few years, I got to know her over the phone and a couple of visits. And then eventually we got together. We were together for a couple of years before we were married. And I had no interest whatsoever in religion. I had walked away from it when I was 14 because of the one major mistake my father made. I realize now that as a child I was looking for God. I was actually quite interested in God, but I spent a lot of my time praying for prayers that he couldn't answer. And the biggest one was that my father would be healed. And of course, to be healed, one has to subject themselves to Christ. And my father wasn't doing this. My father was leading in his own life. What made it very difficult for all of us is my father has a very high IQ, a man of considerable intelligence, but he had never seen that work out into success in his life due to his bipolar nature. And so he made his own life much worse by his constant fretting about the past and his lack of successes. He figured that intelligence should relate to great business prowess and so forth, and wasn't the case. And this, of course, rubbed off on me in the sense that I did not see him satisfied or happy with the things that he did in life, even though I must say others spoke well of him because of his efforts for others. So it taught me as a young man, people are watching us. And yet, as a pastor's son, I would say it had the largest negative effect on me, wasn't just in his absence, but was in how I was treated as we moved from community to community. As a pastor's son in northern logging communities, it's not a popular thing to be. It results in a tremendous amount of persecution. I learned how to run. I didn't learn how to fight because my father told me if I did such a thing that I would face his wrath. And put perspective on it, my father was a logger, 6'2" in height and 225 pounds. So as a young lad, I saw him as a towering man and a man to be feared and respected. And I still have that picture of respect because my father did command respect by his ways, but he also commanded it in obedience. And this gave me a very bent perspective of what God might be like. And so he had told me when I kept asking when I could do certain things, he said, well, when you're 14, you'll be a man and you can make those decisions yourself. And that was a big mistake because at 14, I don't think any of us are ready to. I certainly wasn't ready to make those kind of decisions. And at 14, I decided to walk away from the church, and he didn't resist me on it. He had told me that was my choice to make, and I did so. And I entered the worlds of addiction, sadly. But I am grateful because I have learned over time that our Father in heaven is always working with us. I had no recognition of him being at my side as a child. And in my early adult years, I didn't see God in my life. I saw myself as walking in this world by myself, and what I would get would be attained by me, and what I wouldn't get would be not attained by me. And I met this beautiful young lady, as I said, and I didn't know why I wanted her in my life. In fact, she cringes a little times when I tell it, but she understands and recognizes it now. When I married her, I did not love her because I did not know what love was. All I knew is I liked what she did for me. I saw something in her that I had never seen in anybody else before, or did I recognize? I may have seen it, but I didn't recognize it. But she loved me unconditionally. And no matter what I did wrong, what errors I made, she forgave me and still wanted to be with me. And I struggled with that. I couldn't understand why she would do such a thing. But over years, I've learned that that's what love is. And I learned to love from her, and I love her dearly today. But it's one of those events that took many, many years. I was into our marriage many years before I realized why I continued with her and why she was tolerant of me. She had the Spirit of Christ in her before she ever met Christ. And this, I think it's important. If anything comes out of this testimony, it's the thing I would like us all to see. It took me a long time to see. In his working with us daily, it starts before we recognize it. And I'll start maybe in the city of Kamloops. That's where my wife and I first lived together. I had rented a home. I rented a number of different homes there, but I had this particular one. When she came to me one night. Her brother brought her and all her possessions, and it was unbeknownst to me at the time. She showed up. I hadn't invited her. We hadn't even talked about her coming to live with me. She showed up and said she was moving in. And of course, I didn't understand that she was having her own trials with her father. And I won't go into those details, but it was enough that she did is exactly what got me in the city of Kamloops. I was fleeing from my father. I wanted to be away from his influence, away from the city he lived in. And so I moved there to get away from all that. She moved to join me for the same reasons. And that's where our life began. We lived there for about 9 years. We bought our own home. We worked on it and developed it in the property. It was in a community of acreages outside the city. And that's where we had our first 2 children. We had twins in 1987. My wife at that time was looking for something more. She was finding life with me getting more difficult. And she wasn't saying so. She was always gracious, always quiet and reflective. But, as we've grown together, we've talked about these things. At that point in time, I was working for a corporation as a salesman and assistant manager. I was sales rep for the region, and so I did a number of out-of-town day trips, building centers and so forth. I kept turning down promotions over the years. I just didn't want to move. I was so tired of moving. I did not want to move. I didn't care if I moved out of the house I was in, if I lived the rest of my days. I was so tired of moving and knowing new walls every 6 months that it was now in my control, and I was determined that I owned my own place. I was going to stay there. And so every time promotional opportunities came, I said no. And to the point where they finally said, well, you let us know when you're ready to move, which in 1989, I was getting tired of my job. I could do it with my eyes closed. I'd become efficient at it, and it was boring. And so the opportunity was posted to move to another southern city, and I bid on it. And much to my shock, I didn't get it. And I found out later that one of my peers had got it that I thought was a better choice. And I told the company so, and they were good with that. But then they determined that because I'd asked a bid on that one, that I was willing to move. So they offered to move me to the city of Victoria, which is our capital city here in British Columbia. Beautiful place, but I knew it as a place that rained a lot. So I initially said no. I didn't want to live where it rained a lot. I liked the dry, warm climate that I was living in Kamloops. But then my peers at work and my family said, you've waited a long time for this. You should take that position. And it was a big change. If I were to take this, it would move me from an assistant manager to a regional administrator. And I'd studied for it. I'd taken education working with the company for it, but I wasn't excited about moving to this big city where it rained a lot. Long story short is I eventually succumbed to the pressures around me, and I said, okay, I'll at least go for the interview down there and meet the district manager, which I did. Eventually took the appointment, and over the next month and a half prepared to move. The story of where Christ comes into my life begins here, even though I didn't realize it, because by that time I had beat alcohol and I had beat the smoking and drug addictions in looking for something better. I didn't realize it was Christ working in my life at the time. I give him the glory for it now, but it was a struggle, but I beat those addictions. I've never looked back at them. but that addiction became formed on workaholism. And by this time, that's what I was spending all my time doing. Anyhow, as we moved there, we were traveling. I'd asked if I could travel by vehicle instead of flight, because now as an administrator, the company said, we pay for it all. Just do what you want. You have an expense account. And so we chose to travel. And I'll come back to this event a little later on in this, because we'll start to see how the Lord works in a life. Because I believe when we give our testimony, it's his story or history. The two words I see is his story of his working in our life. It's not our testimony, but it's the testimony of Christ and the victories that he leads us through, unbeknownst to us. At this time, I was on that upward corporate climb. It was all about me. It was all about what I could do and what I would do. And this was difficult for my wife with two little children. But as we got settled into the position, things went very well. We were there a little over a year, and I received a corporate commendation for the most improved district in the corporation. They had changed my position from that of administrator to district administrator, and I became in charge of all corporate, provincial and federal accounts for the government, as well as in charge of the region for all stores, dealerships, and so forth, which at 28 years of age, I was the youngest administrator. There had never been a district administrator with that much region before, and things were going well. I had started to become quite involved in the business community. I was sitting on the board for the finance and credit in the community. And as the capital, that involved exposure to many people of influence. I was quite enjoying what I was doing. I was enjoying the people. I was enjoying the aspects of respect that I had never experienced in my life before. As a pastor's kid, you didn't, as I said, get any respect. And so this was new for me. But I was quite enjoying it. I had a good team. I was trying to build a bigger team. But about this time, my wife, unbeknownst to me, and this is where I'll go back to the beginning of our move, as we were moving, we were driving down through the Lower Mainland, and the radio station channel changed from NL 610 that we had in Kamloops to the local Christian radio station, same frequency on the dial. And as my wife was driving down the road, she had our two sons with her in the vehicle, and I was driving the pickup and carrying freight, pulling a trailer. And she started listening to this, and as she was going down the freeway, there was a large billboard on the side of the road that said, "Jesus saves." And she took this to heart. My mother visited us regularly. My mother, bless her heart, she was the total, and I say was, she's passed on. She was the total eclipse of my father. She was everything that he was not. She was the most wonderful mother a man could ever have the graces of being raised by. And she was the opposite of my father, not just in spiritually, but physically. She was 4'10" and a little bit of a thing, maybe about 90 to 100 pounds at the heaviest that I saw her. But she was, as Dad said, dynamite came in small packages. She was a redhead, and she had a fervent love for Jesus Christ. And praise the Lord, it was due to her many years of prayers for her son in the wilderness that I found Christ. As my wife was driving along, she would listen to this, and it played a bigger part as time went on. I would come out and get in the family car to go for a drive. What's with this crazy Christian station on here? And I would turn it back to the station I was on. She had the car most of the week. On the weekends, this would happen again, and this went on over that first year we were there. I didn't see the connection, couldn't figure out how this kept getting on this channel. I had no idea that when my mother was visiting, what she would do for a month or so at a time. She was taking my wife to church, and my wife had accepted Christ into her life, and I was unaware of this. I thought it was great that she wanted to take the kids on Sunday morning and go to church, because then I could go with my banker buddy and go fishing, which we would do, and come home at lunchtime. We would go early in the morning, come home at lunchtime. But one day she come to me, she'd been to church, and it was budget time, a very busy time at the business. And I was sitting on the couch mulling over some issues I was trying to solve. And she started to ask me questions about the Bible. And I got quite terse, I would say, with her. And I told her I was grateful that she was taking our sons where they would get a good influence of good people. But I wanted nothing to do with her God, because she told me at this time that she had asked him into her life, that, and I wanted nothing to do with speaking of the matter. And This was still a difficult time for me as I go back and look at it. Um, I had received just the week prior a commendation, um, as I mentioned earlier, and life was good. I was looking at moving up very rapidly in the corporation. I had aspirations, they had aspirations for me, and I was seeing these things develop. I walked into the office Monday morning. I had brought a young man that I had seen in my district that I saw had great ability, and I was going to spend the day working with him and training him to put him in a position where he could work at my side. And I spent the day doing so. I had come in that morning and the regional manager wasn't there. I asked my secretary and she said, oh, he had to pay a visit to head office. I thought, that's strange. Usually we discuss these matters, but I gave it no further thought. It was about 2:30 in the afternoon. I got a phone call from Dick Glassford, our corporate personnel manager. And he said, Verne, would you mind staying late at the office today? I'd like to pay you a visit. And I went from peaceful in spirit to very agitated. He and the regional manager walked through the door 6 o'clock. They'd come off the ferry from the mainland. And he informed me that the board of directors had met and that I was being removed from my position, and my whole world fell apart. I wrestled for the next 2 weeks trying to understand what had happened because it was cold, cut and dried without comment. I had just received a commendation that doesn't happen often, and I couldn't understand what was taking place. Mentally, I was starting to collapse. This is what had brought about my father's difficulties with bipolar, is he had had a complete mental breakdown. And I was determined this wasn't going to happen, but I was unable to control my thoughts and expressions. I lived in a world for the next couple of weeks where I didn't eat, I didn't sleep. I contacted our family physician, who was a bishop in the Mormon church, and he worked with me for a few days and said, of this world, there's nothing can help you. In my mind, the only one that could help you would be God. And as a practitioner, that's not a ground I'm allowed to go. And he left me with that. I got up that one morning, and throughout this time, I was going out every day looking for employment. We were new in this city. The bills were large, and I didn't know how we were going to manage. 2 weeks, a couple of weeks into this, about this time, I also found out my wife was with child again. That just added to the stress and the difficulty. I was not finding work. It was difficult at that time in Canada to find work. We were still coming out of a recession. And so I was going out bright and early each morning, putting in applications. This particular morning, I got up and I sat down on the couch and I had my head in my hands and the tears were rolling down my face. And my little son at that time, just not quite, about 18 months old, or pardon me, 2.5 years old. He'd been 18 months when we moved there. He come over, and as a child will do, and my head was down, and he bent his head upside down and he looked up into my face and he says, Daddy, Jesus will give you a job. And I don't know what touched my heart at that moment, but my mother's father was a man such as my mother was, had a deep relationship with Christ. And he had faithfully over the years, every time we would meet, his first greeting was, my son, have you met my Jesus? And I would go, no, Grandpa, I have not met your Jesus. And that's all he would say. He was never pressured me. He only asked it once each time we visited, but he was faithful. And that particular morning, I was going out to put an application in for a job that I very much wanted. The government had formed a new department for taxation called GST, and they were looking for an administrator. And so I went that morning and I put in that application. But as I was going, I was driving down the road and my little pickup truck. And I said, God of heaven, I'm going to give you one chance. I am beyond myself. If you are real to me, you're going to have to restore to me my peace and my quietness and give me rest, because I had been by this time 2 weeks without sleep, without eating. If I looked at food, I couldn't even stand the sight of food. I was deeply distressed. To kind of put a context on how distressed, this doctor that I've been dealing with gave me a drug called Halcyon. The U.S. military uses it in aviation as a knockout drug to give their pilots rest when they are in stress situations. He had told me to take half a tablet, but whatever I did, not to take the full tablet. I took half a tablet, nothing happened. 4 hours later, type of thing, I was still beside myself. So then I took the rest of the 2 tablets he'd given. So I took 2 tablets inside of 4 hours, and it had no effect. And so when I shared this with him, he was quite aghast that I had done such a thing. He said, that should have laid you out for hours. And he said, that's when he told me there's nothing that can help you but the God of heaven. Well, this was one of the most glorious days in my life, because I come home, I went and laid down after going out on this job pursuits. And I laid down in a bedroom that I was sleeping in by myself. My wife had a room where she nursed our children and slept. I would often get up and leave them and go sleep in this private room where I could get good sleep without the disturbance of 2 healthy young boys. And I did this afternoon. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I laid down and I was laying there thinking. And then I looked up and I realized, I'd best get ready for bed. I didn't realize I'd been laying here this long because the sun was low in the sky. And then I got up, and it's always a difficult time to relate, because as I got up to get myself ready for bed, I realized it wasn't the evening sun I was looking at. It was the morning sun. I'd slept for 12 hours, something I hadn't done for so long. It still brings tears to my eyes. We have a loving God. He's there in our deepest distress. And the worst situation we can be in is not knowing he's there. And that is where I was at that point in my life. Been there a few times since, but never in such a way. I think of my son's words, "Daddy, Jesus will get you a job." He couldn't even pronounce it that day. To him, it was a job. But I did get that job. That was the next step. I got a phone call. The tribunal had met, and they had determined that I was a successful candidate and that the job was mine. And so all of a sudden, where there'd been nothing but darkness, I had hope and light. And as the next few weeks passed along, I had no idea how much he could do for us. We were in this time frame. One of the stresses I had faced is we had a 5-year lease on our home. We had lived in hotels for quite some time because there was nothing to purchase. The housing market was going crazy in this particular city. And we had got this place at half the market rate from a military officer who just wanted long-term tenants. But about this time, I got a phone call from his brother-in-law, who was acting as our landlord, saying that my brother-in-law called me. And this was 10 o'clock at night. He said, "I'm sorry to call so late, but he wanted me to call you and let you know right away so you would have time, that we wish to violate the lease. If you're willing, I've been offered a position to relocate for retirement in the city of Victoria." He had thought he would stay positioned to his retirement in Ottawa. And I couldn't say no to him. It was his family home. And so we accepted that. So now my wife was pregnant. At that point, when we learned this, I was still without a job and things were difficult. But all inside of a short period of time here, the Lord brought me a peace, because I wouldn't find that I had the job for some time. I also wouldn't find that we had a home for some time, because we kept looking and we couldn't find anything. And the day to move got closer and closer. But again, the Lord was going to reveal his hand. I not only got that position, I turned it down before I took it. And I turned it down because I had realized I didn't want to enter back into that field where I had no time for children. And my wife put perspective for those that are in relationships out there. When I lost that job, it was the end of the world for me. But the words from my wife's mouth was, "Amen." And I said, woman, you're crazy. And what I couldn't see is she saw it as an opportunity to get me back in her life for for her children, for our children. When we finally found out that we had a place to move into, it was everything we'd asked for. It was a city block from where I was working, which made it such that I could walk to work, which as a father and a husband with the only income in the house in a major city would remove some expenses, make things easier. But when we got to move, I called the company that provided oil for our home. And this was a major turning point for my understanding of how God was. I didn't see him as one interested, as I said, in the details. Even now that he was in my life, I didn't see him as super interested in the finer details in our life. The home we'd been living in was built in the 50s. It was an oil heated home. And so we had to purchase oil on a regular basis. And I'd been told that it would cost me about $300 to heat the home for the winter. About the time I lost my job, we ran out of oil. And so I had them come and fill the tank. This was halfway through the winter. When we went to move, I called the oil company. I said, would you come dip the tank, please? The house is going to change hands, and I'd like to get a credit for what may be left in the tank. I expected the tank would be close to empty, but I did want to be reimbursed for what was in the tank as I tried to figure out how we were going to pay the bills with the new job, new location. About 2 weeks into the new job, I got a letter and a check in the mail from the oil company. It was for the full amount of what I had put in that tank. And so I picked up the phone and I called them. I said, you maybe need them to go out and dip that tank again. That oil heated our home for a better part of 3 months. There's no way that tank is full still. And they said, no, we had the tank dipped and the tank is full. So the credit is yours, which was dearly needed cash. It was $150 that at that time was a goodly amount of cash. And then I realized that our Father in heaven deeply cares in a way I hadn't even yet at that point realized. He had given me a good job. He had given us a home close by, and he'd even given us the funds in which to pay the deposits for our utilities at the new location. How he does it, I don't know. But all I know is that tank was like the widow's tank. It was full of oil. It had heated our home for 3 months, and yet there was not a drop lacking of it when we moved. And through life, I found in the early 3 years of my walk that he does these little things for us. He presents us with opportunities to see him working by providence. And yet, as I've walked with him for these 30 some years, that was in 1991, I don't see that he does it as often anymore. I think he learns to expect us to walk by faith, not by sight. But when I was young in Christ, I saw him do many things for us that were obvious and visible. But when I found Christ, I really didn't know where to go for fellowship. My wife had been attending the Pentecostal church because that's where my mother would take her when she would come to visit. And so that was obviously where we would migrate to. And we went there not because I understood or wanted the faith. I had left the Pentecostal church because I couldn't stand the place. It was a place full of nice people that were hypocrites. That's how I saw Christianity. I saw how they would smile at my father and greet him and say how good it was to see us Sunday morning and treat us differently during the week when we weren't at church. And so I went there as a place because I thought it was required. I thought it was something that Christians did, that we attended church on Sunday. But over the next 3 years, I taught Sunday school. We became very active. And yet both of us were not satisfied with what we were experiencing. We continually brought it for the Lord to take us somewhere else. Not just location, but fellowship. Take us somewhere where we saw more in people an act of faith. And yet we didn't want to be church hoppers, as we saw a lot of people doing. I'm not being fed here, so I will go there. We had seen a lot of people move from church to church, denomination to denomination, and we didn't want to be a part of that. So we stayed where we were. And we prayed that the God of heaven would work in our life. Now, to put a little more perspective on how he was working in our life, it wasn't that he wasn't working, but we were not finding that deep fellowship that we crave. We were seeing him use us to lead others to Christ. I was working at that time. I had not taken the job as auditor for the government. Instead, I had decided to take something mundane, and I'd taken a job as a laborer and a maintenance worker for the local city. But it gave me an opportunity, and the next 300 men that worked there, an opportunity to share Christ, which I did fervently. We used to meet at the church Tuesday mornings. The men, we would gather at 6 a.m. to pray for the Lord's guidance throughout our week. And I had been there at the city, I would say 3 years, a little over 3 years by this time. And I prayed to the Lord that morning. I'd said so to my wife, that I'm tired of being here. There'd been about 6 months by this time where nobody had come to ask me about my faith. I wasn't being able to share my faith, wasn't doing Bible studies. Everything had kind of got really quiet in our life. And I said to the Lord that morning, I said, if you don't bring somebody to me today, I'm going to quit this job and I'm going to find something else, because I'm not being used here. I'm not finding that I'm growing in strength. You need to fix that. And I got to work that morning, and we had a big bulletin board that had our crew labels. It was magnetic, and it would have the crew boss and his team. And I was a floating boss. Sometimes I was a boss, sometimes I was not. Some days I was a foreman, and this particular day I was a foreman. But as I come through the door, the men said, hey, you ought to look at the board this morning. And I looked up there and to see what they were talking of, and nothing new. I'm foreman today, so what? But then I realized on the list of people, there was a name I didn't recognize. I said, so what's with this? And all they said was, lucky you. And I had no idea who had been placed in my truck that day, but I didn't find out till a number of weeks later, because that morning, this individual was having such an experience as I'd had when I found Christ. He was distraught. He was completely upset. His wife had asked him to get out of the house that day, and his world was falling apart. Long story short, at 10 o'clock that morning at coffee time, everybody disappeared to the coffee shop except him. He crawled in the cab of the truck and sat on the far side, lost in his own little world, while I sat and read my Bible on the other side of the truck. All of a sudden, he looked across the truck and he said to me, are you one of them born-again Christians? And by this time, I was not deeply appreciative of the term, nor of the term Christian. I kind of danced around that because, as I said, I wasn't deeply impressed with Christians as a whole. I was working for a personal relationship, but I didn't have a lot of attraction to the term born-again Christian. So I asked him, what does that mean to you? Well, he says, I've known lots of Christians, but he said the born-again ones seem to be different. And I said, so why would you think I'm a born-again Christian? He said, well, I've been watching you today, and you're certainly different. And so he asked me to express my testimony to him, why I had thought I should be a Christian. And so I shared briefly in a few moments what Christ had done for me that day when I woke up. And he said, well, could he do this for me? And I said, well, I have no idea. I don't know what your problem is. Well, because the guys had gone to the coffee shop, they were late getting back. They were gone half an hour instead of 15 minutes. And by the end of that coffee break, he had knelt on the truck floor and asked the Lord into his life, which I had no idea how dramatic it was till over the next couple of weeks. The men that I worked with came to me one at a time, and all of them had the same words. We don't know what you're giving to Jeff, but keep feeding it to him. And I said, well, why? What are you seeing? They said, oh, you have no idea what that man was like until he met you. They saw him as probably the most evil individual they had known. A wife abuser, an alcoholic, a drug addict, a difficult individual. But in that day, the Lord had taken his addictions away, and all he spent his day was irritating people in some way that they were happy to be irritated with the change, in telling them over and over again about this Jesus that he had met that can change your life. And we watched over the next 3 months as this young man and his family grew together. And this was encouraging for me, because about when I was ready to walk away in my impatience with God, he was preparing my life to experience my experience in somebody else. And though I had been sharing with others, I had yet to see God change anyone in the way in which he had changed me. About a year and a half later, let's see, no, it'll be about 6 months later from that time, there was an event that took place at work that we had an Australian gentleman join us. And I had known a few people from Australia over the years. I'd found them to be quite secular people, and this gentleman certainly was very secular. And he started to do something I'd not experienced in my place of employment. He started to mock me for my Christianity. Enough so that one day he was attacking me for my beliefs on marriage and my convictions, and was getting quite loud about it amongst the men, when the senior staff member and what we called Straw Boss 2, the main boss, he stood up and asked him to be quiet. And he got quite belligerent. Well, what's your problem? Haven't you watched this guy? He's a Bible thumper. He's telling the rest of us how to live. And of course, I wasn't doing that. It's by my example that I was living differently, and he was deeply irritated by this. And that's when this foreman, who happened to have grown up with my wife, was well known to me. He said, you know what? He said, you just talked about this man not knowing what it was to really live. He says, well, I'll tell you, I knew him before he became the way he is, and I rather like him how he is now. And he was referring to having partied with me and knowing my alcoholism and everything else in years prior. That was a real shock for me as he bore witness to this man in front of the crew. That I knew Verne before he was like this, and I kind of like him the way he is now. And so this is what the Lord can do. He can, because I didn't see that changing. I was grateful that I could be encouraged by the words of one who, sadly, to this day has not my faith, but has been slowly learning and walking. And I pray one day that somebody will come that he will hear. Somewhere in the midst of all of this, I went to my grandfather's home and, of course, shared with him the joys that I was learning. But about this time, shortly after this Australian fella had come into my workplace, the Lord started to answer our prayer for fellowship of like minds. There was a brochure put out in the city of Victoria. They put out 50,000 copies, paid for by the local members, in endeavor to bring in an evangelist and to share the Advent message with our community. When it was first presented at our weekly Bible study, of which I was a part, a number of people showed up at the Bible study with this brochure because it was on prophecy. And I had a great interest in prophecy, but I'd already determined I wasn't going because for a number of reasons. And in the end, none of us went except one old gentleman that had used to be a captain of the Salvation Army and a pastor himself, and he decided to go and see. 2 weeks into the seminars, he came to Bruce and myself. At the time, I was vice president of men's fellowship for men's ministry, and Bruce Mino was president. And we had been laboring with the Lord to do many things. I think I'll use our time to finish up on this, and next time I will tell more about how we came into the Adventist Church. For those of you that don't necessarily or haven't necessarily seen miracles in your own life, what I want to share now was dramatic, very dramatic for my wife and I, and for Bruce Mino. Bruce, bless his heart, we've lost him in past years, but he was, I would say, the most true Christian with the deepest relationship that up until then I'd seen in anyone except my mother. But this gentleman, nothing could irritate this man. I saw many difficult things come into his life, and all he would look at it and say, with a smile on his face, glory, glory, what will the Lord bring of this? And of course, it wasn't until we heard the Adventist message that we understood the magnitude and the spirit behind that. But as we were leading men's fellowship, we were both young. I was 35 years of age. Bruce was in his early 40s. We didn't have a lot of self-confidence in spiritual matters. We had both done well in business, but we didn't have a lot of depth in leading others in spiritual matters. And so when we were asked if we would lead men's fellowship, put a little perspective on it, the city of Victoria is the place where pastors, regardless of denomination, missionaries go to retire. It's a beautiful city to live in, has a fairly moderate climate. And so we were in a church full of retired pastors and mission ministers. And so we felt that we were under the watchful eye more than we would have normally. We really didn't know what to do. We had asked Claire Bergman, who had been leading out in Bible study, where we saw these brochures. He had been a director for Men's Fellowship, and the local chapter also led the province. And so we felt it was a great responsibility. And we asked him if he would join us for our first board meeting in directing this ministry. And he said, well, I can, but I can't come till 9 o'clock. He said, tonight is the night that is my turn to look after my aging mother, Thursday night. One of the gentlemen who was meeting with us was known to me. He was a gentleman of East Indian history. He was the leader of the prayer ministry for 100 Huntley Street in Canada, which is a large television ministry here that I was well aware of. I'd grown up next to David Maines and his wife, who were the directors. They had been ministers to us in camp meeting as a child in the Pentecostal church. This gentleman was with us that day as secretary for Men's Fellowship. And both Bruce and I voiced that we struggled with prayer. I've always struggled with prayer. I'm easily distracted. I would get 2 or 3 minutes into my prayer and my mind would be somewhere else. I found difficulty in what I saw as a one-way communication, as did Bruce. Yet Bruce had a relationship with Christ that I had not yet experienced. Anyhow, the long and the short is we got on our knees at 7 o'clock and we asked this gentleman of Eastern descent to lead out in prayer. And we heard prayer such as we'd never heard before. This man spoke to God like he was in the room. All of a sudden, the doorbell rang, and Bruce asked me if I would get it. And I said, sure, I would get it. And I went downstairs. It was in a 4-story townhouse, and I went all the way to the bottom to answer the door. And lo and behold, there was Claire. I said to Claire, you've come early. What's happened? He said, no, I'm not early. It's 9 o'clock. I'm not early at all. And now I was deeply confused because we'd only started our meeting in my mind about 15 minutes before. And so I come upstairs only to be faced with the same experience from Bruce. Oh, Claire, you're early. And Claire said, no, I'm not early. It's 9 o'clock. And kind of like my experience on the bed going from 3 o'clock till 3 o'clock. We had been in prayer for 2 hours and didn't even realize. And it was at that point that we realized the Lord, he was going to use us despite our shortcomings. And so we put out a request to the complete area to meet at the Noose Bay camp. We wanted to have a weekend day of fasting and prayer. Who would come? Over the next 6 weeks, while we were waiting for this event to transpire, we only had 10 people apply, and they were all from our local church. We got a letter of apology from one pastor that he couldn't come. He'd love to come, but he couldn't. They were dedicating their church that weekend. But out of 26 churches, we sent this request out. The only man that was responded was in ours. And this really showed us the deep distress that God's church was in everywhere, because we'd sent this out to all the denominations except the Adventists, because we weren't aware of their existence even. We went to this weekend, and I'll wrap up with this for today. I believe our time is almost up. We'd had a bus. Claire was the bus driver. He drove our church bus, and we went up the Up Island, and we gathered together, and we were sharing our testimonies. We determined it would be a testimony weekend of fasting and prayer, what the Lord was doing in our lives. And we were into this about an hour when the door opened, and a gentleman walked in that none of us had seen before. And he asked if this was the event that was posted at the local church on the bulletin board. And we said it was. Welcome, join us. And he had something deeply on his mind that he wanted to share. And he was a mature man in his late 40s. And he informed us that, sorry, he hadn't got a hold of us, but he didn't see the sign until just an hour or so before. He had been off to college for 4 years. He had gone and taken a major in Bible theology and had just graduated and returned to Nanaimo, which was his home city where he had run his business for many years, which he had closed to pursue God. And he said, gentlemen, I am deeply burdened. He said, while I was at college, I studied the Word of God and I found many contradictions in the Word of God. But he said there was one I deeply found that I want to share with you and ask your opinion. He said, as I studied the Word of God, I found that we keep a time called communion, but he said, we don't wash our feet like the Bible speaks of. And he said, I was deeply convicted that we were missing something. He said, what do you gentlemen think? And so we spent considerable time in discussion that evening. We decided about midnight we should all go off and get some sleep, which we all went off to the different cabins. It's a very large facility. And we went off there, and one by one, we found ourselves back in the mess hall in front of the fireplace that we just left, most of us, within the last hour or so. None of us could sleep. We were all bothered by what this man had brought forward, because in all of us, we agreed later that if this had been brought up at any other time, we would have thought of it as legalism. People trying to work their way into the kingdom, doing acts that were required of them. But this gentleman had put it to us. He had laid it out from Scripture in a way that all of us were deeply touched. And we spent the rest of that day discussing what the Lord would have us do. What are we missing? Where else are we in error? Because we became convicted as Pentecostals who avoid legalism, that this man had something to say. And so we had a blessed time. We had now been there 24 hours. It was time to go. We were going to head back home Sabbath evening, or Saturday evening to us, and so that we could be with our families on Sunday. This was to have been 24 hours of fasting and prayer. We got back to Victoria, and I was completely tired because I had worked paving, very difficult physical job all day Friday. And so I'd been up since Friday morning, worked a hard day, and been up all night and all Saturday. So when I got home, the children were anxious to see me, but I said to my wife, I'm tired. I said, I'm going to lay down. And I went up, give the children a hug, and went up and laid down on the bed. And I was laying there fading out when all of a sudden I felt the warmth on my feet. I had said nothing to my wife. I hadn't told her anything about the weekend. She'd asked me about it. I said, I've got to have some rest. I'll talk to you about it later. She was at the foot of the bed. She had a basin of water. She was washing my feet. I sat up in bed and I looked at her and I said, woman, what are you doing? She said, I don't know. Next time we meet, I'll share with you what the Lord was preparing us for. It would be quite some time before we understood what that was all about. I understand now that was God in heaven still trying to remove the hardness of my heart, because he'd given me a wife that had been listening to his voice for many years. She just didn't know his name. And I'm so grateful that he allowed her to come into my life as the man that I was at the time, and yet put her at risk, knowing what he intended to do. And I know for each of us in our lives, I know I've heard people say to us, maybe I'll add this thought. Glenn Richmond, who had been the leader of Men's Fellowship for many years, during this time, this 3 years of wanting to find other fellowship, he had asked me if I could provide a speaker for our Men's Fellowship meeting. And I had pleasure of working with a young man who was like me. He wasn't following the Lord. But his father was the captain of the Anastasis Mercy Ship, which travels the oceans, bringing food and help to children around the world. And that same evening that I asked him to come and give his testimony, I asked Glenn Richmond to give his. And he said to me, I've got nothing to share, Verne. I've been a Christian from my youth. I've never walked apart from Christ. There's nothing dramatic in my walk. I brought a man from my workplace that night to here. And this gentleman who had balked at sharing his testimony had agreed to. And he gave his testimony. And this gentleman I had brought from work had never heard such a thing. He asked the Lord to make a change in his life. And I said, well, Patrick, I said, what touched you so much about this man's testimony? He said, Verne, you know the life I've lived. He says, I can't believe that a man of his age could have lived all his life and never done any of the things I did. This man tells us that he has walked with the God of heaven all his life. He's never been tempted to do any of the things you and I have done. He said, this bespeaks to me of something I don't understand. And Patrick to this day struggles. He still reads his Bible every day. He hasn't met Christ quite in the personal way. I would pray that he would. But that day was life-changing for him because he saw in this man whose testimony wasn't a rescue from drug addiction or anything dramatic, but he saw in this man that from his youth had walked with Christ. And this really spoke to me of the diversity of the God that we live with, of his great love for us. Very grateful for the opportunity to come to your room, Eva. I remember the first time I heard you in another room, and I asked you if you would mind if I joined. I see this happening in our group. I see it happening all over the world. This trial that COVID has brought upon us has brought the advent of Zoom as a new tool, an opportunity. I've met Mark before in Daniel Mace's room, such as I met you. And I've seen individuals from their rooms come into my room seeking the same experience. Our meeting last night had a couple people in it that are in the land of decision, that are struggling. And I pray the Lord will continue to use these venues, these opportunities. Next time there's opportunity, I would like to share with you how the Lord brought us into the Advent message and what he did for us and others in that. And maybe we'll see how that goes, maybe a third time, certainly not 5 times, Eva. But I would like to share what the Lord is doing and what he'll do for us if we'll just realize that he can use us whoever we are, wherever we are. And his idea of talents is very different from what our ideas of talents may be. Again, thank you, Eva. I'm grateful always. I wrestle with these sharings. It shows my inability sometimes to maintain my composure, but that's a big part of my testimony, and I'll close with that thought. Because of the difficulties of being a pastor's kid when I was a child, I garnered the nickname Rock. You can beat on him, but you can't make him cry. And this was the name that I received in my teen years from my peers at school, that though they persecuted me, they couldn't make me let go. And I'm grateful the Lord has taught me how to cry, because I was pretty hard of heart. I didn't know how to relate to people that did so, and I saw men that cried as weak. That is what my father had taught me, that to be a man, you have to stand up all of the time. And I'm a testimony that you don't have to. We have a compassionate and loving God that will labor to soften our hearts and to bring us into his fold. Thank you, folks, for listening. Glad to share this out.
Thank you so much, Verne. It's the rock made me cry several times. So you were touching, the Lord was touching my heart for sure. And yeah, so yeah, do you have experienced much of God's changing power in your heart? Have you experienced that, since your father were treating you like he did when you were young and probably maybe older too? Have you that experience that God has changed your heart towards him?
Oh, absolutely. Very, very much. I love him with all my heart. I wish he could understand the love of Christ. Now with his dementia, he hasn't the capacity. Um, prayed many days for the mercy of the Lord that I will see him again one day, because I have to say I'm not convinced I will. I've known his character very well, and I've not seen in him the character I believe that we have to have. So I have to trust that the Lord has seen in him something that I have not. I know he tried. I've never been angry with my father. I've never hated him like some children have. He despised his own father, who I thought of very highly. My grandfather was a wonderful Christian man. I think back to that time of finding Christ. Well, maybe I'll mention this one last thing that shows us the immensity of how God works with us. When I got those walking papers that day and my whole world crumbled, there was no reason why I had been dismissed. After I found myself looking for that work, I got a phone call from Dick Glassford, the personnel manager. He's a secular man, not a man of faith. And he said to me, Verne, he said, I couldn't sleep last night. So I'll tell you, I don't know why I'm calling you. I'm hoping you can tell me. He said, Verne, we don't know why we dismissed you. We took a vote on the board. It was 3-2 out of 5. You lost. He said, personally, I didn't vote in your favor. And yet I don't know why, and I'm deeply bothered by it. Can you tell me why? Now, this is a man with his master's degree in psychology, heads up a company at that time responsible for the staffing of approximately 300 stores, a man of great influence and power. And he was telling me he didn't understand why he'd taken my career away, because his vote carried the most weight. He knew me personally from the years working with the business, and the company trusted in him for his judgment of character. And I was able to say to him that day, Dick, I do understand, because the man that you knew then is not the man that's talking to you today. I said, you may not understand that. But I said, and he was concerned because he had expected that I would take him and the corporation to court and sue them for a large sum for wrongful dismissal. But what he didn't know is I had found Christ in the interim. And because of the influence I had at my avail, corporate lawyers, good corporate lawyers. I had them on retainer in my work. But I hadn't gone to them. I went to a friend who was in charge of government finance. He was the highest authority in the city for finance. And I'd asked his advice. And he said, well, here's a man that you need to talk to. And he gave me the card for his personal lawyer. He said, I have already spoken to him on your behalf, Verne, and he will grant you free time of tenure. Go and talk to him. And I did, and I met with him, and I told him the situation, and I was grateful that the Lord put such a man there that day. He said, under the circumstances, we can sue them big time, and you will get a large sum. But he said, I'm going to give you advice I don't give to many. You have a young family. You have financial needs today. He said, I advise to them that you give them a plea deal, that you not take them to court, that you offer them a settlement outside of court. And he says, I believe you'll find more success for your family in that regard. And so I did. I called Dick up. This had been about 2 weeks before him calling me back. And I said to him, I said, Dick, I said, I've been in counsel and I've been advised that I could take you to court, but I'm not going to. I said, if you will find it to change the severance you have offered me to such and such, I will settle out of court. And he said, I will call our lawyers and see what they say. And he called me back 2 hours later and he said, I've been talking with our lawyer and she tells me that what you're asking is extremely reasonable under the circumstances. Where would you like the funds and when and how? And so this time when he called me, much bothered, trying to understand why he had done what he'd done. As I shared with him briefly, there was only so much I could say to a man that wasn't of faith at all. But I said, this has been a change in my life, and this is the reason I didn't sue you. He said, what can we do to help, Verne? He said, I'd really like to help fix what we've done. And I said, well, I've been really struggling to find a job. I said, I could certainly use a letter of recommendation. He said, that I can do. And that day he couried me by airmail, which came by helicopter. And he sent it so that I had it that afternoon. He sent it to me on colored letterhead, and he gave me a full recommendation for employment, which was instrumental in getting the position that I did get, that I didn't take. There's many things. I could go on and on about how the Lord worked in these things, but this to me was, I pray somehow that man, that the Lord sent somebody to testify to him, because I saw that, as my wife and I have said to others, because the night before, if you recall, when I first shared, Sunday morning, my wife would come to me, Sunday afternoon, my wife would come to me with questions, and I turned her away. That the following morning, as we said, the Lord kicked the apple box out from under my platform. Because having had a letter of commendation, there was absolutely no reason for me to lose my position. And yet the Lord had moved these men Friday afternoon to call the district manager Monday morning to come before them to raise my continuance with the company as a question. And yet, from the witness of the personnel manager, he himself did not know why. This I find just flabbergasting. Amen. That the Lord would do such a thing to save Amen. Such as I.
Amen. God can.
My wife had never walked like this before, and she's done so many times.
God can and will turn everything to the best for us.
Amen.
So, since you were called the Rock, it was hard for you to cry and show feelings, and just show maybe compassion, since you had that background. Wasn't that a huge step when you could first time maybe felt some tears or compassion? I can see now God has made you a man who easily are touched by his spirit and can, feel some tears when you think about what God has been doing for you.
It was very difficult. It's difficult to this day. I struggle with it still because, by the time I found the Lord, I wasn't a child. I wasn't in my youth anymore. I had become very hardened. I'd become very accustomed to having my will. I didn't have the self-confidence that others saw. Though I climbed up, those that worked with me saw that I had great confidence, but I didn't have it. It was a facade that I had built around me, a shell of protection. I did not have that inner confidence, though it appeared so on the outside. And I still have wrestled with that. It's only been the last 5 years where I'm working now. I currently work as the administrator for 4 businesses for a large clinic here in town. I've labored with them to build it from a small company of 5 employees to where November 1st we will be 60 some employees. And so the Lord has given me success in these things, but it wasn't till I worked with these Christian gentlemen that that'll be part of my third part, more than likely, how he has started to teach me that he doesn't want us to have self-confidence. He wants us to be dependent on him. And we come to that in many different ways. And for me, the persecution that I felt as a minister's child, I would not wish on anyone. It's a great evil. It's a difficult time. And as you noted, it gave me the nickname Rock. And that gave me a hard heart. I did not, when I say I was dismissed without cause, many things went through my mind of what cause could have been, because I was more heavy-handed in many ways. If I could go back and treat some of my employees in a different fashion, and yes, I treated them justly, they had discipline coming, but if I could have manifested Christ in that, what difference I could have been in their life. I can't do that. I can't change that. But going forward, I would pray each day that he continues to make us men that can weep at the altar, because I believe this is the character of God himself. One of the things that's touched me the most about God we serve is that he would have come and died himself for us if it was possible. And so I found the teaching, the Trinitarian teaching of him and the Father being one in person, a great affront, because it removes, well, I said it many times in Christian circles, that if that is the God that we serve, I want nothing to do with him, because what touched me so deeply that brought me to him was the testimony of my grandfather that became more and more apparent, was that fatherhood figure that wasn't available to me in my youth. I didn't know my grandfather in my early days, but he parented my mother, and my mother was able to share with me enough of the love of God in my youth that when I saw these things, I didn't push back. When I saw this, what I saw as a weakness, a propensity to cry, when I shared of his goodness, I was brought to a remembrance of my mother and my grandfather. And I will share, when I share of our testimony and coming into the Adventist church, how the Lord rewarded my grandfather for his faithfulness.
So, Mark, I could see that your hand was up. It is down now, but did you have any comments or questions?
It was a powerful testimony, and what strikes me is that how important it is for us as children, because my testimony that I gave showed a father for a young boy that's not real involved with their children. I don't know what I'm trying to say. If a father's not involved, if a father's not the same way in front of his children as he is in front of other children and other people. You see one man when he's with the people outside of your home, and then when he's in the home, he's different. That is such a detrimental thing for a boy, I think, with his father, because that's what happened with me also. And it sends you spinning off, like Verne says at 14. His father says at 14 you can make a decision.
Oops, he fell out. Yeah, I think probably many children are experiences that when you come to church dressed up and you're greeting everyone, and then you come back to the car and then there is a fight or whatever. And I think that is very destructional, or what this word is in English for children. So, yeah. Well, Frederick, you are up. Are you having a question or comment?
Just say hello to Verne, seen in early in the program with David Barron. Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's a good and blessed group to join too. Yeah, so my last question is before we leave each other is, have you ever said that simple question which you were asked, Verne, have you met Jesus? I think it really gave me some thoughts for how to ask a person.
Well, for me, it was very much how he said it. It was not just, have you met Jesus, but have you met my Jesus? And he said it with affection and a connection that I didn't see. I wasn't listening at the time. But when I needed the Lord, I didn't find the Lord in the church. I found the Lord in my pickup truck looking for work. And I simply said, God of my grandfather, if you're really there, I need you now. And he revealed himself to me in a manner in which I, to this day, am astounded. He's a personal God. He's not, as I said, in the deist form. I have always believed in the Creator. Even when I walked away, I did not disbelieve. It was too obvious to me. Nature is something I love. I've spent many years pursuing nature. My wife and I, when we first got together, ran an import quarantine for citizens, which are parrots. We imported animals. I worked in the pet industry. I've always admired God's creation. and I could see clearly that there was a creator, that this wasn't happenstance. I got in much trouble as a child in school with teachers and stuff because of my unwillingness to accept the evolutionary theory. And yet, that's part of what led me to that day. I believe that maybe he was different. If he could be for me like he was for my grandfather, that would be a great thing.
Amen. Thank you. Yeah, Michael, have you a question or a comment?
No, but I had also experience in my car. I was coming to God when I was searching myself in the light of God. I didn't ask to say something, but when you asked me, so I can maybe just say that my experience is when I met God in the water. I came to God. I was begging, praying to God in my car that He has to help me, and I find that He helped me through my problems, and that was I don't know what to say, but I have got a lot of I have seen a lot of wonders.
Well, your sound disappeared.
It's a bad connection here. I have some cell phone connection.
Yeah, isn't that great, brothers and sisters? That help from us, and the Lord is there. When we cry out from the depth of our hearts, He will always answer us. So maybe that's some good words to stop with. So yeah, maybe Verne, would you like to have the closing prayer?
For me, God will always be like a father for me.
Amen. Amen.
Yeah. Father in heaven, we thank you for your testimony. You come to us through the works you do in men. You touch each of us, male or female, with your nearness in our greatest times of difficulty. Help us, Lord, to daily walk in the strength of these experiences when you seem so distant. Let us be reminded of these times in our past where we have cried out. And Lord, may we learn to cry out before our troubles are great. Be with us, Lord, this Sabbath day. Continue to work in us that work that must be done for this work to be finished. Our world is in difficult times right now, Lord. I pray today that you will open the eyes of those, especially our Advent brethren, that do not see that the time is near. They see only a secular event. You do not make the connection. Help us, Lord, to make that connection more deeply and give us the words to express it to others. Give us the zeal to express it to others, and give us the time. Help us to make the time, Lord. We are caught up in the things of this life, the busyness of the day, busyness of the week. Free us from this bondage, Lord, for we know your deepest intent is to use us, that others might see you. The only opportunity they will have to see you is through your children. Manifest yourself today through us to not only one another, to encourage us in our walk as this day, but to those, Lord, who have never known your name. All this we ask in the precious name of Jesus, who gave all for us.